If you walked down to the harbor on a cold December morning and saw a ship on fire drifting toward the pier, would you stand and watch? The crew on the burning ship is already in the lifeboats. The fire is spreading. The harbor is full of houses. There is no siren. Would you keep walking? Or would you stop and watch, like every other person on the waterfront that morning? On December 6, 1917, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, hundreds of people lined the waterfront to watch. None of them knew that the ship in front of them was the largest bomb that had ever floated. This is Disaster Lens. In the winter of 1917, Halifax was a war city. The Great War was in its fourth year, and the long, narrow harbor at the eastern edge of Canada had become the busiest convoy port in the British Empire. Every transatlantic ship carrying soldiers, food, munitions, or hospital cases passed through Halifax. The town grew rich on it. It also grew careless. The town itself was a city of wood. Tenements climbed the steep slope above the harbor. Schools, churches, sugar refineries, foundries, rope walks. Around 50,000 people, half of them poor, packed into the lee of the slope, with the water at their feet and a wind they had never had reason to fear coming off the bay. What made Halifax dangerous on paper was a single feature of its geography. To get from the open Atlantic into the deep Bedford Basin, where convoys formed up, every ship had to thread a half-mile bottleneck called the Narrows. It was wide enough to pass another ship, but only just. In peacetime, the rule of the Narrows was simple, slow, single file, right-hand side, and no ship carrying explosives in the harbor at the same time as any other ship, in peacetime. But in wartime, the peacetime rules of the Narrows had been quietly set aside. The Mont-Blanc, a small French freighter, steaming up the coast that morning, was carrying 2,300 tons of high explosives, TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, and steel drums of benzol lashed to her deck. She was, in modern terms, a floating bomb the size of a small office building. By the rules that had kept Halifax safe for a century, she should not have entered the harbor at all without warning every other ship to clear. By the rules that were in force on December 6, 1917, she carried no red munitions flag at all, because a red flag would have told the German submarine fleet exactly what she was and where to put a torpedo. So she sailed in silent. Just one more grey hull, joining the morning traffic, on the way to a war that had not yet noticed her. The Mont-Blanc was not the only ship in a hurry that morning. Coming the other way, southbound out of the Bedford Basin, was the SS Imo, a Norwegian-registered freighter chartered as a Belgian relief vessel, bound across the Atlantic with food aid for the occupied population. She was a mission of mercy with a deadline she had already missed. The Imo had been delayed by a coal-loading mistake the night before, and her captain wanted those hours back. She came down the Narrows fast, and she came down on the wrong side of the channel. On the bridge of the Mont-Blanc, the harbor pilot, a Canadian named Francis Mackey, the best in the port, saw the Imo coming up the wrong lane and did what the rulebook said. He sounded one long whistle blast. "I am holding my course." The Imo sounded 2 blasts back. "I am altering to port." Mackey held his ship to starboard where the rules put him. The Imo held her course down the wrong side. 2 ships, 2 pilots, 2 whistle signals, both correct under the rules each of them was using, both pointing at the same patch of water. At the last moment, with collision certain, both captains tried to swerve the same way. The Mont-Blanc cut sharply across the Imo's bow to clear her. The Imo, finally reversing engines, kicked her stern out, and her steel bow scraped a long, glancing wound down the Mont-Blanc's right side. The cargo of benzol lashed in steel drums on the deck, split open and poured down inside the hull. Then the iron of the Imo's bow scraped the iron of the Mont-Blanc's plates one last time, and a single spark went where a spark should never have gone. One spark, on the fuel, above the bomb. The Mont-Blanc began to burn. The fire took hold of the benzol on deck almost instantly, too fast to fight. The captain knew exactly what was below his feet. He gave one order: abandon ship. The entire French crew rowed for the far shore at maximum speed, screaming warnings the people on the Halifax side could not understand, because none of them spoke French, and none of them knew that the burning ship, now drifting silently across the harbor, was carrying 2,300 tons of high explosive into the heart of their city. For 20 minutes, the Mont-Blanc burned and drifted. She moved at the pace of a slow walk, pulled by the tide. She nudged gently into Pier 6 on the Halifax shore, just below the working-class district of Richmond, and began to set the wooden pier on fire. And along the harbor, people came to watch. A burning ship in the harbor was a spectacle, not a danger. The fires of foundries and the smoke of convoys were the everyday sky of Halifax. People left their houses to look. Mothers held babies up to the window. Boys ran down from the hill. Office workers crowded to the upper floor windows of the sugar refinery and the wharf buildings. The Halifax Fire Brigade arrived on Pier 6 with hand pumps to fight the flames. None of them knew. The crew of the Mont-Blanc, rowing for safety on the far shore, had no way to tell them. A few hundred yards up the harbor, in a small wooden railway dispatch office, a man named Vince Coleman heard from a fleeing sailor what was about to happen. Coleman ran for the door. Then he stopped. There was a passenger train, full of people, due to roll into Halifax in 8 minutes. Coleman went back to his desk, sat down, and began to tap out a message on the telegraph wire to every station on the line. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6. Goodbye, boys. At 9:04 in the morning, the Mont-Blanc detonated. Every clock in Halifax stopped at that moment, because every clock in Halifax was destroyed in that moment. The explosion was the largest man-made blast the world had ever seen, a fact that would hold true for almost 3 decades, until the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It vaporized the ship instantly. The Mont-Blanc's forward gun, its barrel melted away by the heat, was hurled 3.5 miles north and landed near Albro Lake in Dartmouth. The half-ton shank of her anchor was thrown 2 miles south to Armdale and buried itself in the woods. The water of the harbor was driven away from the blast and then rolled back as a wave that surged 18 meters, nearly 60 feet, above the high water mark, sweeping homes and people off the foreshore. At least 1,800 people died, most of them in the first instant. 9,000 more were injured. The entire working-class district of Richmond, the slope of homes above Pier 6, where Coleman had sent his last message, was wiped flat. Schools full of children at the morning bell, sugar refinery workers at the upper windows, the fire crews on the pier, every man of them, mothers with infants at the kitchen window, all of them killed where they stood, in the same instant, by the largest single second of human violence the planet had ever recorded. Every clock in Halifax stopped at 9:04 and 35 seconds. And then, for one cold minute, nothing happened. And then a black snow of soot and oil began to fall. The blast was not the end of it. The shockwave had blown out every window in Halifax. And behind those windows, people had been looking out at the fire. Hundreds of citizens were left permanently blinded by flying glass. In a single instant, citywide. The new science of ophthalmology would later trace its modern emergency procedures to the Halifax wharves in the days that followed. The fires from overturned stoves spread through the wooden ruins. That afternoon, a blizzard came down out of the Atlantic and buried the survivors and the dead together under 16 inches of snow. Trains carrying medical supplies from across Canada and the United States, including a relief train from Boston that arrived within 36 hours of the blast, could not get through to the city. Boston's gratitude for that aid became the annual Halifax Christmas tree gift to the city of Boston, a tradition that runs unbroken to this day. In the weeks that followed, two governments, Canadian and British, opened inquiries. They blamed the pilots. Francis Mackey, the Canadian pilot on the Mont-Blanc, was arrested, charged with manslaughter, and thrown in jail. The captain of the Mont-Blanc was charged too. So was the chief naval officer of the harbour. And then a Nova Scotia Supreme Court justice, examining the case on a writ of habeas corpus, ruled that the charges against Mackey were unfounded. He was released. The charges were eventually dropped. But the federal minister of Marine and Fisheries refused for years to restore Mackey's pilot's license, and he was never compensated for the 4 years of lost work. He got his license back eventually. He stayed in Halifax until his death in 1961, and, by every account, did not speak publicly about the morning of December 6th for the rest of his life. Halifax rebuilt. The flattened slope where Richmond had stood became one of the first planned reconstruction neighborhoods in North America, a model of fireproof brick and concrete that the city designed to be a memorial in the shape of houses. New laws were written. Ammunition ships would never again share a harbor with a populated city without coordination. Convoy harbors around the world tightened their rules. The wartime suspensions that had brought the Mont-Blanc up, the Narrows without warning began, slowly, to be re-examined. Halifax is remembered as an accident. 2 ships, 2 pilots, 1 wrong-side maneuver, 1 spark. A tragedy of split seconds. But to read it that way is to miss the chain that brought those 2 ships into the same patch of water in the first place. Before the war, Halifax had 3 layered protections against exactly the morning of December 6th. Munition ships were not allowed to enter the inner harbor. They anchored offshore, and their cargo was ferried in by smaller boats. Munition ships flew a red warning flag, visible from every shore, and all other harbor traffic stopped while that flag was moving. 3 rules, layered. Each one of them, on its own, would have kept the Mont-Blanc out of the Narrows that morning. In wartime, all 3 were quietly relaxed. The Mont-Blanc steamed straight into the inner harbor. She flew no red flag, on the rationale that a flag would tell a German submarine exactly what to torpedo on her way back across the Atlantic. The harbor's other vessels did not clear for her, because they had no way of knowing what she was. Allied authorities had decided, link by link, that the risk of a U-boat sinking outweighed the risk of a harbor collision. The decision was rational. It was also a trade. The risk was not removed. It was moved from the open Atlantic to the wharves of a wooden city. And on a cold morning at the bottleneck of the Narrows, every link in the trade came due at once. That is the lesson of Halifax. A safety rule you have moved is still a risk you carry, even if you have moved it somewhere you have stopped watching. Every disaster is a chain of human decisions. And sometimes that chain is the long, quiet sound of one safeguard, then another, being traded for a different one, by people who never imagined the trade would be called in. That is what we are here to study.